Can Egypt and Ethiopia resolve their dispute over water? Disagreements over Africa's largest dam project are raising fears of conflict. How should one of our most vital resources be managed? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Hashim Ahalbarra. Water is often said to be the source of life, and it's increasingly becoming the source of conflict in various parts of the world. The building of the largest hydroelectric dam in Africa has reignited a dispute about its longest river, the Nile. Ethiopia says the $5 billion Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam near the border with Sudan will be a massive boost to the economy and create power for 100 million Ethiopians. Egypt fears that will be at its expense and reduce its share of Nile water. Ethiopian engineers are being urged to fill the reservoir behind the dam more slowly, then release a higher quantity of water downstream. Both sides have agreed to resume talks that collapsed earlier this month, and Egypt is accepting the United States' offer to mediate the dispute. Ethiopia's Prime Minister and this year's Nobel Peace Prize winner suggested the dispute could lead to a war. Egypt condemned his comments as unacceptable.
You asked about Egypt saying that they will take action, and what I kindly want you to understand is that a quarter of Ethiopia's population is poor and young, so if we are to go to war with other Africans, we can have many millions on the front line. But wars do not have many benefits. It will not benefit Egypt, it will not benefit Sudan, and it will not benefit us. Some may have the capability of firing missiles, and some may say, I will bomb Cairo if it is for my country and my flag. But peace cannot be brought by bombing and by fighting.
Now, Egypt and Ethiopia aren't the only ones involved in the dispute. Sudan has been involved in the negotiations as the dam is located near its border with Ethiopia. Let's get more from Hiba Morgan in the capital, Khartoum.
Tensions have been on the rise between Ethiopia and Egypt over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the dam which Ethiopia is building on the Blue Nile and which is said to be the largest hydroelectric dam in Africa upon its completion next year. Now, since the start of the construction in 2011, Egypt has repeatedly expressed concern over the impact of the dam on its shares of Nile waters, which its population heavily relies on. Technical committees between the two sides are set to resume negotiations on the filling and the operation of the dam. But the last round of talks between Ethiopia and Egypt, which included Sudan earlier this month here in Sudanese capital Khartoum, ended in a deadlock. So Egypt wanted Ethiopia to guarantee that the dam would be releasing 40 billion cubic meters, but Ethiopia said that the dam's maximum capacity would be only 30 billion. The recent statements by the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who said that Ethiopia is ready to mobilize more than 1 million men to defend the dam, did not help with the tensions. Now, caught up in the middle between the two sides is Sudan, which, while it did not say it wanted 40 billion cubic meters released by the dam, it said that Ethiopia should try to release 35 billion cubic meters. Sudan is trying to play mediator between the two sides, between Ethiopia and Egypt, while at the same time trying to guarantee that its shares of Nile waters is not impacted. Hiba Morgan for Inside Story.
Let's take a look at the long-running dispute. The Nile competes with the Amazon as being the longest river in the world. It's definitely the longest in Africa, flowing through 11 countries. Nearly 250 million Africans rely on the river. But Egypt and Sudan claim exclusive rights to the water. While 90% of Egypt's fresh water comes from the Nile, 84% of the river's water flows from Ethiopia. The long-running dispute intensified when Ethiopia began building the largest hydroelectric power plant in Africa. Egypt fears the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam will stop the flow of its vital water source, and the Egyptians are using treaties drafted by Britain last century to argue its case. Let's introduce our panel. In Khartoum, Ahmed Al-Mufti, former negotiator on the Nile Waters Agreement. In Brussels, William Davison, senior analyst on Ethiopia at the International Crisis Group. And in London, Alam Ahmed, professor of knowledge management and sustainable development at the University of East London. Welcome to you. Ahmed, since you've been part of the team that has negotiated the Nile waters, I just want to ask you, is the whole issue now about filling the reservoir within an interval of time of 5 to 7 years and then releasing water with about 35 to 40 billion cubic meters annually? Is this the real problem now facing the three countries, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan?
I think according to the strategy of Ethiopia, this is now the problem. The duration for the first filling of the dam. But to my understanding, the interests of Sudan are more than that, which is water security. And this has never been discussed before. So I believe the negotiations now about the first filling, this is a peanuts compared to the interest of the Sudan, which is claiming to be food basket for the whole world. And its current waters definitely will not meet that target and should be looking for water security more than anything else. So this is why I think this is the reason for the failure of the negotiations.
William, there's been this escalation in rhetoric over the last few months between Ethiopia and Egypt. Do you have any concern that in the absence of an agreement, the potential for a military confrontation is there?
Well, not particularly. I mean, there has certainly been some heated rhetoric recently, as you refer to, and unfortunately, we've also seen that in the past, notably from Cairo in the past, but of course, we had the comments from the Ethiopian Prime Minister in Parliament recently talking about a possible eventuality of conflict. But conflict really is very unlikely here. It's not in either side's interest, and in fact, if Egypt is particularly concerned about its water supply, then the obvious way to try and ensure adequate water supplies is to cooperate with Ethiopia. And if there's any increase in the aggressive attitude from either side, if there's a worsening of relations, let alone conflict, then Egypt will be further away from its goal of ensuring those adequate water supplies.
Alam, the Egyptians say this is an issue of utmost importance. It's an existential issue for them, and therefore they want to be part of operating the dam. Ethiopia says this is an issue of national sovereignty. And as you've heard from Ahmed al-Mufti, he says that for Sudan, this is also a crucial issue. Now, is there any room for compromise where the three parties can cooperate for the sake of a permanent solution?
Thank you for your invitation. I think the issue here we need to consider the perspective of this whole complex situation we are facing now. First of all, I think we need to remind ourselves one of the major obstacles or challenges for Africa overall is the lack of inadequacy of electricity. Africa's main challenge is really electricity. And thus, we're going to hinder many of the development projects across the whole continent, not just in these three countries. Secondly, water and electricity, or water and energy, are considered two of the most important items in the all initiative by countries to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. Now, taking these two into account, the argument of the Egyptian about this issue of the dam and the water is vital. Yes, water is vital not just for Egypt, it's also for Sudan. And we need to remind, as my colleague from Sudan just said, Sudan is considered to be the food basket for the entire Africa and the Arab countries. And eventually, Sudan needs the water in order to fulfill that, if you like, ambitious target for the whole continent, not just for Sudan. Egypt got its own political problems because within Egypt, even the distribution of water is not really evenly, if you like, equitable. The Egyptians are very worried about the amount of water because we know that most of the businesses are run by corporates, and the corporates are actually belong to the army in Egypt. The issue of national security is true because there was a report 6-7 years ago from the European Union about how the world will look like in 2030 or 2020, and now we're already in 2020. And they argue that water will be one of the major issues of conflict between countries. Okay. And that countries which will depend on others on water, they will have serious challenges in the future.
We'll talk about those things in detail later in the show. Ahmed, You have been talking about water source as an issue from a Sudanese perspective. But others would argue that the problem with Sudan and Egypt is that they go back to an agreement that was signed almost 100 years ago to claim exclusive rights when the world has changed and countries like Ethiopia are saying basically we need to build a dam for the sake of our own economy, our own population, and 60% of our population does not have access to electricity. This dam is the answer.
I believe there is no problem about Ethiopia's right to generate electricity or even to use water. This is her right, and the three countries are sharing the waters. But the problem, to my understanding, since the agreement of 1902, is that there is a deal between the government of Sudan and the government of Ethiopia. The deal is that part of Sudan were given to the Ethiopia, and as a consideration for that part taken by Ethiopia is that whenever it intends to build any water structure, whether this dam or other, they should consult with the Sudan and agree before starting the building. So I believe this is the problem since 2011, but it has never been discussed. The discussion now is confined only to the first filling, and I think this is not fair, and this will not end the conflict, because what has been said by the Ethiopian Prime Minister that he's going to call millions of people to defend the dam. That means he wants to defend whatever he has acquired in this negotiation since 2011. And I believe unless the rights of all three countries were granted, this will be a year for conflict in the future.
But then, William, the Ethiopians would tell you that we were not part of the 1959 agreement, and therefore, as far as Ethiopia is concerned, everything should start from scratch. Do you see the potential for the need to reinvent the whole agreement, start from square one?
Yes, in many ways, I think that would be the ideal solution. And in fact, there's already a treaty in place. I mean, it's not in place because it's not been ratified by enough countries, but it's been drafted. That's the Cooperative Framework Agreement. Now, which all the Nile countries, in theory, could sign up to. Now, the idea of that treaty is to agree principles of equitable usage and then to establish a joint institution to manage the Nile River Basin. Now, that's the ideal solution, because then all countries can play their role and they can negotiate between each other about how to share this water resource. The problem with the current legal framework is, as you suggest, Ethiopia and other upstream countries, they do not accept it. They do not accept the legality of a treaty that they were not party to. So on the one hand, you have Egypt talking about historic rights, but they stem from treaties that Ethiopia and other countries do not accept. So really, yes, an ideal solution is a new legal framework, and already a substantive amount of work has been done to go towards that, and that's the Cooperative Framework Agreement. Now, obviously, there's sticking points about the text, because if there wasn't, then it would have been ratified and Egypt and Sudan would be on board. So there needs to be further discussions. Those points need to be ironed out. But I would suggest that that is the right way forward in the long term. And that's something which hopefully will occur after this initial conversation, this initial issue over the Renaissance Dam is solved.
Alam, from your own perspective, do you think this is an issue of concern about future water scarcity, or do you think that the current levels of water have been traditionally poorly managed by both the Sudanese and by the Egyptian governments?
That's a very good question in this whole argument. Yes, it's a very good question. As I said earlier, water is being raised by many scholars, United Nations, World Bank, lots of reports as one of the key issues and challenges for the future. And I think you're right. In both of them, there is issues here. Number one, clearly there is a very poor management of water in both Sudan and Egypt. There's no question about that. And entire Africa have failed to manage its water and produce electricity. I already mentioned that. So that's one item. And the second item is this whole technical, this is when we teach students at the university, we teach them project management, but we also teach them something separately. We call it mega projects or complex projects. This dam is actually both of them, mega project and a complex project. And this is a very serious, it's a giant project. Even European leading companies or in countries like the UK, Canada, the US, they normally deal with it very sophisticatedly. It's not an easy project. So this to be given to a company which it tends to be somehow or another based in the military, caused most of the chaos for the project. The project information is lacking. We don't know any scientific paperwork, not me, many scientists, many people who have looked into this issue of the dam for the last 6 or 7 years. You hardly find any data about the risk assessment, about the environmental impact assessment, about the economic assessment, socio-economic impact, community, the impact on people. And these are normally the key issues. We look at them when we start thinking of a project like this. So I think the major issue is poor management, yes, worrying about the future, because we don't do something we call it now forecast or future planning. Now people, they think of what's going to happen in 2050. And we in Sudan or in Egypt or even Ethiopia itself, we are very short-sighted. And therefore, people in these 3 countries, and particularly Egypt and Sudan, they should really leave this issue to the scientist, to the engineer, to the economist, to the community expert, to the social scientist. And that's where they don't know exactly what is happening here. Governments in both countries are lacking.
Ahmed, since you've been part of the negotiating team about the Nile waters, the idea of extending the filling period to 5 or 6 or 7 years, plus releasing water to match something like 35 billion cubic meters a year, is that enough? Does it satisfy the needs of both Sudan and Egypt?
To me, my understanding is that the first filling of the dam, this is not the issue. To me, the issue is that the negotiations have been running since 2011 without any legal framework. There is an international framework, there is a regional framework, and there is a bilateral framework. So unless these negotiations are conducted within a legal framework, because the Nile River is not the only shared river in the world. There are more than 250 Niles. All constructions on those Niles, on those rivers, started by a legal frame to agree to the rights of each country. And then you come to this small issue of the first filling.
So what is the issue here from as far as Sudan is concerned? The need for a new legal framework or what?
What we need is water security, and this has been agreed upon in the Entebbe agreement without any refusal from any Nile basin country, including Ethiopia. So what I am proposing is that unless these negotiations are built on those agreed principles in the Entebbe, which has taken 10 years of negotiations, so why we just discard that and start new, and then in 2015 come up with the declaration of principles? This is the problem, and I think even now Ethiopia, if Ethiopia agreed to the 7 years or 6 years for the first filling, I think this will solve the problem for the immediate needs, but for the future needs, which will come 1 year, 2 years, 3 years ago, the problem will come again. Yeah.
William, when you listen to the concerns voiced by the Egyptians, to a certain extent, you feel the anxiety there, because they're concerned that if the Ethiopians implement what they're trying to do with the dam, this is something that could wipe out businesses in Egypt, push millions of farmers out of business. It's going to create a massive problem for Egypt.
Potentially, I mean, if things went badly, then I mean, this is why it's such an important issue, because of those potentially severe consequences that you are referring to. But the important thing, or one of the important things to understand here, or to recognise, is that there does seem to be a technical compromise here. You've talked about the 35 billion cubic meters figure and a period of 4 to 7 years. Now, that's relevant, because that's the sort of figure and that's the sort of period that experts believe the dam can be filled at, and it can be done in a way which doesn't cause significant water supplies downstream to Sudan and Egypt. But the absolutely key thing here is flexibility. And that flexibility relates to the variable rainfall. Now, my understanding is that the Egyptians' biggest concerns are that they do not have an agreement on minimum releases, and they do not have an agreement from Ethiopia that they will be flexible in all circumstances, including drought conditions.
Yes, I see.
This is really what's needed, I think. That
Alam, we're talking about bogged down a little bit in the details about what's happening now, but then when you were talking previously about the need for forward planning. So in 2050, estimates suggest that 1 billion people will live in countries through which the Nile and its tributaries flow. So we're talking about a population growth that would pose enormous strains and challenges on a continent. How to tackle this issue in the near future?
I think to tackle this in the future, I think the Egyptian, the Sudanese, and the Ethiopian, they should really work collectively and constructively with other African partners, because the problems in Africa are huge. And we need to consider this as an African issue rather than Ethiopian or Sudanese or Egyptian. That's number one. And number two, we need to understand, I'll give you just one example. And a United Nations report in 2016, if I remember correctly, talking about renewable energy, it stated that South Korea produced electricity greater than the entire African continent. Just imagine, South Korea alone, production of electricity is greater than the entire African continent. So this should be considered as an African issue, number one. And number two, they need to understand this issue will have serious environmental and economical and social effects in the future. And number three, which is very important, they have to bring experts. Expert, I mean here, project management expert, complex project expert, social scientist, economist, and they have to be independent. And when you mentioned earlier about Sudan is trying to negotiate between both Egypt and Ethiopia, I don't think that's the right way we solve the problems like this. We need to look to the bigger picture.
This brings me to this question.
This is fundamentally a sustainable development issue, and it needs to be left to the expert. Within the countries, we have experts in all these three countries. And we need to look to international experts, like in Louvain, for example. They have a big center at the University of Louvain for irrigation, and so on. So this is how we can solve, how we tackle issues like this. We're no longer in an African problem. This is a global phenomena, and we have to consider it and deal with it from a global perspective, understanding best practices and what works and what didn't work in the past.
Ahmed Al-Mufti, less than 30 seconds, please. Don't you think that it's about time, instead of talking about the legal frameworks, to talk about alternatives, desalination, renewable energy, technology, new platform that would bring all those countries to negotiate a better outcome for their own population instead of just focusing on what is my right, what is not my right?
I agree fully, and the Nile Basin countries, with the support of many international partners, have been discussing this since 1959 for 10 years, and then they concluded the Entebbe Agreement, which was about to be agreed by all. They have agreed to 98%. So I believe that is the solution, because I think this feeling is only one issue of so many issues. So to be picked out and treated might solve the problem currently, but in the future will generate more problems.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I promise you that we'll have many more opportunities in the near future to tackle this sensitive, vital issue for millions and millions of people in the African continent. Ahmed Al-Mufti, William Davison, Alam. Ahmed, thank you very much indeed. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Ahl Barra, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.